Because you are stuck with this person after all. Do you really want to put up with this little annoyance for decades on end? Or maybe it's worth 2 months of misery, being really honest with each other in order to establish longer term trust and peace. Hey everyone, welcome back to my series on Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life. In this video, we're talking about rule number 10. And rule number 10 goes, be precise in your speech. So Peterson talks about the importance of being precise, because if we're not precise, then we are vague. And when we are vague, that's when chaos can begin to lurk underneath the surface. So Peterson tells this story in the chapter, and the story is called There's No Such Thing as a Dragon. And this is a children's story, but it has a lot of symbolic meaning. And I feel like this story really encapsulates the message of this chapter of rule number 10. And so the story is about a boy named Billy. And one day, Billy wakes up and sees a little dragon sitting on the edge of his bed. And at this point, the dragon is just the size of a small house cat. So he gets out of bed and goes to tell his mom, "Mom, there is a dragon on my bed." But the mom dismisses it and says, "There's no such thing as a dragon." And the dragon gets bigger and bigger until it completely fills the house. And this whole time, the mom won't admit that dragons exist. And even as she cleans the house, she has to maneuver around the dragon, go out the doors and through the windows just to clean her house, and it takes her forever, right? And so the dragon continues to grow until it completely uproots the house, and then it goes up the mountain. And this whole time, the mom still won't admit that there is a dragon, right? Until Billy is so fed up with it, and he says, "Mom, there is a dragon." And at this moment, the dragon starts to shrink and shrink and shrink until it is the size of a house cat again. And at this point, everyone finally acknowledges that, number one, dragons do exist, and number two, it is much preferable for them to be this size than their gigantic size counterpart. And so at the end of the story, the mom, with her eyes reluctantly opened, she says, "Why did it have to get so big?" And Billy responds to her quietly, "Maybe it wanted to be noticed." And there's the punchline. Maybe it wanted to be noticed. You know, a lot of times we ask ourselves, why did my life explode? Why did this relationship or my marriage implode and get shattered into a million pieces? You know, maybe all of that resentment and bitterness and unhappiness that we continue to sweep under the rug, that we continue to ignore for years and years and years, it wanted to be noticed, and it continued to compound and grow like the dragon until we couldn't ignore it any longer, and it explodes in our face. And that is why Peterson says it's important for us to specify what the problems are, to be courageous enough to look at it and to confront these issues, and to do it as soon as possible. You know, he says it's better to address the problem as close to the time of its emergence as possible, because the longer that you put it off, the more that it grows, and the more uncomfortable you are with addressing it and admitting it. And sometimes we choose to ignore these problems out of fear, or because we don't want to deal with it. You know, we find it too difficult. We want to avoid the misery of having to be honest about these very uncomfortable emotions. Maybe we are purposefully making a mess out of our lives to take revenge on God. And maybe we want to be the martyr, because honestly, sometimes being the martyr makes us feel better about ourselves, and it gives us a reason to ignore what the real problem is. So we might have all these excuses for ignoring the dragon, but we have to understand that the alternative is much worse. And Peterson talks about what happens when we continue to ignore these issues, when we ignore the elephant in the room. He says, every one of the 300,000 unrevealed issues which have been lied about, avoided, rationalized away, hidden like an army of skeletons in some great horrific closet, bursts forth like Noah's flood, drowning everything. There's no ark, because no one built one, even though everyone felt the storm gathering. Don't ever underestimate the destructive power of sins of omission. And we talked about what these sins of omission are in our last video. Basically, there's two types of sins, right? Sin of commission, which is when we do something that we know is wrong, and sin of omission, when we don't do something that we know we should have done. And that includes speaking up for ourselves. That includes addressing the problem. That includes confronting the issues, right? The elephant in the room, the dragons in the house. That is the sin of omission. And when we ignore them, when we do nothing, and really that's all we need to do to guarantee that these dragons will only grow and fester to the point where we cannot deal with them anymore, the only thing we need to do is to do nothing. And that is a sin. So the first step to dealing with these issues, the chaos lurking underneath the surface, the first step is to admit that there is a problem, right? We can't solve a problem if we don't know what it is. So being precise in our speech includes being precise about what the problem is. And included in defining what the problem is defining what we want. For example, in a marriage, if I feel like there's an issue between me and my spouse, part of defining the problem is also being honest with ourselves what it is exactly that I want. You know, sometimes we're unable to define that, and it takes a lot of soul searching and being real with ourselves. At the end of the day, we might realize that the problem is with us, right? We might realize that what we want perhaps is immature and is unrealistic. But if we don't understand what it is that we want, we might not ever even come to that realization. But other times they may very well be valid, necessary, and worthwhile for us to be honest about and to address with our partners. Because you are stuck with this person after all. Do you really want to put up with this little annoyance for decades on end? Or maybe it's worth 2 months of misery, being really honest with each other in order to establish longer term trust and peace. And Peterson also says there is very little in a marriage that is so little it's not worth arguing about. So to be precise, you have to be courageous. You also have to be real with yourself and think. Number one, what is wrong exactly? What is wrong exactly? It's not everything. Everything can't be wrong because everything would be too overwhelming. We have to be able to define what individual beliefs and actions have failed and need to be changed. And also, when we define the problem, when we define the monster, we see it for what it really is, right? It becomes much more manageable. If we never define it, then it remains this really vague, but also very big list of all the possible extreme, terrible things that can happen. And so being willing to confront the fear, and if we could just face reality, which is terrible in itself, we might find it to be much more manageable than our even more terrible imagination. And number two, what do I want exactly? And oftentimes it's really hard for us to define what we want because on one hand, we're afraid that once we define what we want, we will be disappointed if we don't get what we want, right? Once we put ourselves out on the line like that, it does make us vulnerable to more rejection and hurt and disappointment. But if you consider the alternative, if you stay vague, if you never define what you want, then you will never get it, right? You will never be able to reach a destination that has not been defined. So being willing, being courageous enough to think about it and to define what do I want exactly. So when I was reading this chapter, I was reminded of a couple relationships in my own life where being precise in my speech I felt was really helpful at the time. When I was younger, I remember one evening, a friend of mine told me, and he just felt the need to tell me that a lot of my friends that I thought I was close with, that I really cared about, he told me that they had a lot of issues with me and that they didn't like me as much as I thought that they did. And when he said this, I remember that night I cried so much and it kind of just shattered my self-esteem. You know, before that point in my life, I think I was quite confident, maybe a little too confident, admittedly, but that night it sort of shattered that. And I could have just gone on with my life feeling a little sorry for myself and keeping a distance from these so-called friends, right? Thinking, how could they say these things about me behind my back, blah, blah, blah. But instead, what I decided to do at that young age, and for which I'm actually really proud, was I decided to just confront them and encourage them to be very specific about the issues that they had with me. And I was totally open-minded, and I was willing also to repent if I had done or said anything that was immature, that offended them. And if they were vague about it, I really did press them to be very specific about what the issues were, about what the events were. And because I did that with these people in my life, one by one, I actually met up with them and talked with them. And if I had to, I asked for their forgiveness, or I would explain and try to clarify some misunderstanding, And because I did this, I feel like I really strengthened a lot of relationships, and it actually created much deeper friendships. And it also allowed me to gain more self-respect for myself, because I was speaking up for myself and I was bringing clarity to these misunderstandings instead of allowing awkwardness or bitterness to grow in our relationships. So I'm really happy that I did that. And I feel like that was an example of being precise in our speech, addressing the elephant in the room, being courageous enough to confront the issues, confront the problems instead of sweeping them under the rug. Because when we do that, a lot of the time, they can destroy our friendships and relationships needlessly. But if we're just willing to confront them and be brave about it, we may actually come out on the other side better and stronger than before. And I can testify to that. So yeah, that's my summary. Hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope that you found some of the points really helpful to you. Be precise in your speech. Thanks for watching, and make sure you're subscribed and turn on that notification bell. I'll see you in the next video. Bye!